Hello everyone and welcome back to your Access channel. This is me, Mrs. Rania, your instructor and your guide in this video. So in today's video we are going to continue our novel about Jane Eyre. Or actually we are going to continue our series on episodes about Jane Eyre. We reached to the chapter 2. Today we are going to have chapter 2. So this chapter called Leaving Gateshead. So just let me with you just have a quick reminder about how chapter 1 ended. We can say that Jane was locked in her room, or actually in the Red Room, as a punishment for her quarreling and fighting with John Reed, her cousin. And of course, the poor girl was terrified and panicked about this room. She thought that she saw her uncle ghost, Mr. Reed, her uncle Reed ghost. So the girl was terrified and fainted on the floor. So this is how the first chapter ended. So let's continue together what happened to the poor girl in this chapter and how Jane planning to leave Gateshead. Or what does it mean, this title? Let's discover together. I hope that you are ready. So let's do it. Come on. So Jane wakes up confused and disoriented. She starts to realize where she is. In her own bedroom. And of course that's something comforted her after she was locked in the Red Room. It was something good for her to see herself again in her own room. Bessie and Dr. Lowett are there looking after her. And Dr. Lowett, by the way, is a doctor that Mrs. Reed called to take care or just to looking after Jane. Bessie offers to get Jane something to eat or drink and is generally really nice to her, which is unbelievable to Jane. Jane's pretty confused by this kindness. Bessie goes into another room and Jane overhears her ask the housemaid Sarah to sleep in the nursery because she's scared that Jane could die. So after several days, Dr. Lowett comes to see how Jane is doing. She's not sick, and he starts trying to figure out why she's so miserable. Actually, the girl physically okay, and nothing about her, but according to her in general, she looks miserable. And the doctor looks smart and he actually wanted to figure out what about Jane or what about her. So Bessie tells Dr. Lowett things that make Jane sound childish. That she's crying because she didn't get to go out in the carriage with everyone else. And that she was sick because she had a fall. Of course, Jane's pretty angry about these charges and denied them both. Of course, all of these things didn't happen, and Jane was very angry for hearing something like that, and explains that the fall was actually when John Reed knocked her down, not because that she had a fall. And then a bell rings and Bessie had to go and to have dinner with the other servants. This is the bell for servants to have their dinners. And Dr. Lowett is left alone with Jane. And actually, Dr. Lowett asked Bessie to go and leave him with Jane. So Jane tells Dr. Lowett about the ghost. And he finds that pretty silly. Jane protests that she's miserable for a lot of other reasons. Not only about the ghost that she saw. But actually, she starts to complain about her life in that home. She doesn't have any immediate family. Mrs. Reed and her son, John, are very cruel to her. And of course, the rest of the family, according to Georgiana and Eliza, also all of them are cruel to her. And she's made to feel that she doesn't have any right to live at Gateshead. So she never feel that she belonged to that house or to that home. She never feel the feeling of that his or sorry her home. Dr. Lloyd starts asking about different ways Jane could leave Gateshead. Just I asked her if you can go anywhere. Does she have any other family? She's not sure, but she doesn't think so, and she wouldn't want to live with them if they were poor anyway. Could she go to school? He asked her, of course. And the little girl just think a while. And Jane tells Dr. Lloyd that she does want to go to school. Actually, she heard something bad about schools. We know that, but for her, schools is something better than her life at Gateshead. And he advises Mrs. Reed to send her to one. Jane is waiting patiently, convinced that Mrs. Reed will send her to school soon, even though she hasn't said so. But she still awaits. So days and weeks passed, and nothing. Mrs. Reed say nothing about the school. So one day, as she was scolding her, as usual, scolding, of course, Mrs. Reed scolding Jane, Jane suddenly threw a question at Mrs. Reed. The girl started to be outspoken. The girl started to fight for her right. The words just came out without planning to say them. Just spontaneously, she came out with some words or question. She said or asked her, "What would Uncle Reed say if he were alive?" Jane asked. Mrs. Reed with fear staring at Jane as if she was a ghost. Jane continued, "My Uncle Reed is now in heaven and can see all you think and do. And so can my parents. They know how you hate me and are cruel to me." So the girl's words wasn't point, and actually Mrs. Reed was terrified by her look at her, the way that she looked at her. So Mrs. Reed just smacked Jane's face and left her without a word. Jane was scolded for sure as a result for an hour by Bessie as the most ungrateful child in the world. And of course the same old story reminded her that you have no right to say that and you have to be grateful for the lady that kept you in her house. And so on the morning of the 15th of January, Bessie rushed up to Jane's room to tell her a visitor wanted to see her. Of course, Mrs. Reed would be there too, and she was frightened of seeing her again. I'm talking about Jane. She didn't see her from the last time that she told her her question. And now she had to face her one more time. She was frightened to see her, but something she must. When Jane nervously entered the breakfast room, she looked up at a black column, or at least that is what he looked like to Jane Eyre. He was a tall, thin man, dressed in black, with a cold, stony face at the top of the column. The man starts asking Jane questions. She tells him her name, but when he asks if she's a good child, she doesn't know what to say. Of course, she knows Mrs. Reed will contradict her if she answers yes. Actually, all the time she described her as the most wicked girl in the world. The man assumes that the girl is, or this means that is Jane is naughty, and starts lecturing her on how wicked children go to hell. We are definitely starting to dislike this man and of course Jane. The man asks Jane about reading her Bible. she does. And she tells him also about the parts she likes. And of course, some parts that she dislikes in the Bible, of course, as a child, innocent child. He says to her that she has a wicked heart and should pray to God to change it. Mrs. Reed steps in at this point. She doesn't really care about Jane's heart. She reminds Mr. Brocklehurst, this is the name of the man that Jenner described him. He called Brocklehurst, and actually this is a very suitable name for such a man. So, Mrs. Reed reminds Mr. Brocklehurst that she already told him Jane is unpleasant and a liar and needs special watching at Lord School. This is which is where he's going to take Jane. Lord School. Jane is really upset that Mrs. Reed accuses her of being a liar in front of Mr. Brocklehurst, who is obviously someone important at Lord School. She's called him, or she can't tell Mrs. Reed is just making things harder for her by saying something like that for sure at the new school. So in that part, I just wanted to highlight the theme about the love and hate at Jane Eyre. And we talked about the major themes, and just in short about the major theme in Jane Eyre. One of those themes we talk about love and hate in the novel. So actually, I now just wanted to highlight the part of the hate about in this part. Hate the Reed family. Let us together see how is this shown in the novel, how the hate theme shown in the novel. Look at that, for example. From the beginning of the novel, the reader learns that the Reed family are cruel towards Jane. I think that very obvious, even until the second chapter. They don't treat her as family member, no at all, and tell her she is not wanted all of the time, especially for John Reed. All of the time scolded Jane and tell her that you aren't a member of the family and you have to be grateful for keeping you here. Let's see what is the evidence for what I said. Look at that. John Reed is vicious towards Jane and scolds her. You have no business to take our books. You are a dependent. Mama says you have no money. Your father left you none. You ought to beg and not to live here with a gentleman's children like us. Of course, it's very obvious now how John hates Jane. So, to analyze this, we can say that John says that Jane shouldn't be living with them, reflecting what his mother believes. The repetition of the personal pronoun you, as you can see in the previous quotes. In the previous quotation, he all the time say you and repeat it many times. So it illustrates John's hatred for Jane and highlight the difference between her and them. So I think it's very obvious now how the theme of hate obvious here in the novel. And of course, after that also we are going to meet characters that Jane will hate. Okay, but just I'd like to discuss it with you one by one as much as I could. So let's continue. Let's back to the novel and continue the instance. As he leaves, of course, Mr. Brocklehurst gives Jane a book called The Child's Guide. It's full of stories about sinful children who die unpleasantly. Look how this is so cruel for just 10 years little girl. Jane stands staring at Mrs. Reed. Of course, after Mr. Brocklehurst leave. After Mr. Brocklehurst left the room, Jane stands staring at Mrs. Reed and refuses to leave the room. When she's ordered to, she's pissed. She's very angry now, furious. She confronts Mrs. Reed, denying that she, or Jane, tells lies. She told her, I didn't tell lies. Why accuse me of something like that? Saying that, or saying she hates Mrs. Reed and John, and she will never come back again to see them. She declared everything for Mrs. Reed about her real feeling towards her. After Jane tells Mrs. Reed off like this, she feels really good. The truth has set her free. I think that I can feel her. Try just to put yourself in her place. All over the time when you read the novel, I would like you to just try to ask yourself, what would I do if I am in her position? Do I speak about my right? Do I fight for my right? Or just I will say yes and okay and that's right and just be very negative like that. At least Jane was outspoken girl. She's a very brave girl. She knows the consequences, but at least she fight for her right. So this is, or actually by this situation we end, or the chapter ends. And as usual, I just recommend that you have to read the whole chapter in order to answer the complete questions about, or answer any comment about this novel. You have to read the whole chapter. I just give you the most important instance and the most important events that happens in the chapter. So now, just as usual, we are going to answer some questions about this chapter to make sure that we understand the most important points in this chapter. So let's try to answer the first one together. How did Bessie treat Jane? Of course, according to what happened in this chapter, not generally. For sure, yeah, we said that, or she treated Jane very kindly in this chapter. She asks her, or asks if she wanted to drink or eat something, and that thing was unbelievable for Jane. She didn't believe how kind she is. So how did Bessie treat Jane? Very kindly. Okay, so let's move on to the second question. What did Bessie ask Sarah to do, and why? What did Bessie ask Sarah, the other maid, to do, and why? Come on, try to just remember at the early of this chapter what Bessie asked Sarah to do. You're right, that's right. He asked Sarah to sleep with her next to Jane. Why? That's right, because actually she was afraid that the girl, or Jane, could die. Okay, let's move on to the third question. And this one is the comments. We said before that we have two different or many different styles of questions according to the novel, but the most remarkable, or the most familiar questions about the two styles, the WH questions and the comments questions. And according to the comment, I said that we have to mention who said this quotation and to whom, and we have to say our comment in about this situation in general. So let's try to answer this comment. Mrs. Reed was too hard on her, I think. So to answer this question, as I said, you have to mention first who said these words. And come on, if you just read the whole chapter, you are going to find out that these words said by Miss Bessie to the maid Sarah when she asked her to come to sleep with her because she was afraid that the poor girl or Jane could die. Okay? Pretty nice. Let's move on to the fourth question. How did Jane feel after her experience in the Red Room? Of course, we just can say that the girl was terrified and she was panicked, and she would never forget about this in her life, even after she get out from the room, and she was fine now, but she would never forget her bad experience about it, and she would never forget how her aunt Mrs. Reed was so cruel to her, to just locked her in this room without even a candle. So she will never forget that experience, and she was terrified and panicked from this. I'm crying because I'm miserable. This one is a common question. I'm crying because I'm miserable. This is pretty obvious that these words said by little Jane Eyre. To whom? Come on, try to think. Yeah, for sure, you're right. To Dr. Lloyd. So this word said by Jane Eyre, or the little Jane, to Dr. Lloyd. Of course, after he asked her about what about her, or why she seems to be miserable, and that she started to say to him the reasons why she looked miserable, or she actually feel miserable in this house, or why she actually was crying. So let's move on to the last question in this episode. You have no relations apart from Mrs. Reed? You have no relations apart from Mrs. Reed? This is another comment. So this word said by Dr. Lloyd, of course, to Jane. When they were discussing about leaving Gateshead and going to another place, as a result that Jane didn't like staying at, of course, at Gateshead, and saying that she never feel that she's one member of this family. So Mr. or Dr. Lloyd suggests that maybe she had other relatives from Mrs. Reed, apart from Mrs. Reed, but of course the girl replied that she didn't know anyone, and even though if she had other relatives, if they are if they were poor, she didn't want to live with them anymore. So with this question, we just ended our session for today. I'd like to thank you a lot for having me today and for watching, and hope you just read the whole chapter in detail in order to answer any question, and in order to answer and to just understand and analyze each part in the chapter. Thank you for having me today, and see you next time. Thank you. This is me, Mrs. Rania, your instructor and your guide. Thank you. See you later.